let me tell you a story of power and glory, everything that matters, like the hereafter. In every chapter, this book will capture love's creation and show you the way.
All right, so good to see you guys this morning. I been thinking about what I would talk about this week, and I meditated on it and listened and pray, and I got this phrase, and it really is a phrase that came back to me from an article that I read some years ago. I read an article a few years ago by a man by the name of Bill Harris. How many of you are familiar with Bill Harris? Any of you? Bill Harris is the director of Centerpoint Research, and one of my teachers, and also it's Centerpoint Research is they've created a wonderful program that helps people to meditate more deeply. Let's put it that way, using certain sounds to help. And I've been working with that for a number of years now and found it extremely valuable. Found it very, very valuable. So if you're not familiar with that, look it up. But he wrote this wonderful article, and that's where my title comes, Tips for Traveling Through Troubled Times. Anybody ever had any troubled times? Anybody noticed anything about troubled times? I think there are those who would say that we're in troubled times right now. And maybe that is a reflection of what they themselves are going through. And I think that's important for us to really notice that oftentimes when we're seeing and experiencing troubled times, it is primarily because we see ourselves going through troubled times. Sometimes I've noticed, and I've been meaning to actually take this up with the source, that things are not always going the way that I think I'd like for them to. Anybody ever notice that? You ever notice how sometimes things just don't go the way you think you want them to go?
The source knows that you
Yeah, probably so. Probably so. The source probably knows that I feel that way, but that's one of the things that I got to listening and thinking about, and realize that a lot of the lessons that I have in life are about realizing that life is not always supposed to go the way that I think it's supposed to go. But the life can and will go in a way that oftentimes is even better than the way I think it's supposed to go. It's hard for me to see that sometimes. Have you always noticed that? Sometimes you have to wait a little while in order to see that. But I read this article, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these wonderful tips about how to move through troubled times. Troubled times could be a challenge in a relationship. Troubled times could be challenges with our finances. It could be a challenge with our health. It could be a challenge with our work situation. It could be a challenge with what's going on in the world today. All of those we could classify as troubled times, couldn't we? And so I heard this phrase, and I was trying to look up where I heard this, but I didn't find it. But there was a saying that if you find yourself going through a dark time, keep going. It's important to keep going. And so, as I was thinking about what we would share, I came across this story. Max Lucado, in a book called The Eye of the Storm, tells the story of Chippy the parakeet. He writes, Chippy the parakeet never saw it coming. One second he was perfectly perched on his cage, singing away, and the next he was sucked in, washed up, and blown over. The problems began when Chippy's owner decided to clean Chippy's cage with a vacuum cleaner. She removed the attachment from the end of the hose and stuck it in the cage. The phone rang and she turned to pick up, and as soon as she did, Chippy got sucked in. The bird owner gasped, put down the phone, turned off the vacuum, and opened the bag, and there was Chippy, still alive but stunned. And since the bird was covered with dust and soot, she grabbed him and raced to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and held Chippy under the water, running water, And then realized that Chippy was soaked and shivering. She did what any compassionate bird owner would do. She reached for the hair dryer and blasted the pet with hot air. Poor Chippy never knew what hit him. A few days after the trauma, the reporter who initially had written about the story even contacted Chippy's owner to see how the bird was recovering, and the owner said, well, Chippy doesn't seem to be singing as much anymore. He just sits and stares. Well, it's hard not to see why. Sucked in, washed up, and blown over. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Ever felt like that? So, came across another great story. There's a photographer for a national magazine was assigned to get photos of a great forest fire, and so there was the smoke on the scene had hampered him being able to get close to the fire, and so he asked the home office to hire a plane so he could get up above it and take pictures of the fire. And so he made arrangements, and all the arrangements were all made. He was told to go at once to the airport where the plane would be waiting for him. And so when he arrived at the airport, a plane was warming up near the runway, and he jumped in with his equipment and yelled, "Let's go, let's go." And the pilot swung the plane into the wind, and they soon were up in the air. And so he says, "Fly over the north side of the fires." And he said, "What?" He says, "Make 3 or 4 low passes over the fire." He says, "Why?" He says, "Because I need to take pictures. That's what I do. Why are you asking me this?" He says, "Well, aren't you the instructor?" Up in the air. Ever felt up in the air? Yeah. I think sometimes we find ourselves, I'm going to move this microphone away. I think I don't need this one. Pardon me a second. Thank you. Sometimes we find ourselves washed up, blown over, up in the air. We find ourselves going through challenging times and circumstances. Some of you may be experiencing that right now, and some of you may not, and that's all very, very good. But I think it's valuable to have some awarenesses and some tips for if and when, well, probably better to say when we do go through challenging times, because the reality is life is about challenge in many ways, isn't it? It's really one of the main ingredients of life. If you're not experiencing challenges in some way, you're probably not experiencing life, if you think about it. You know, the only ones who don't experience challenges are those that are not experiencing life at this time. Doesn't that make sense? Yeah. So those who are really aware and in tune with their own energy and their own life are recognizing that the challenges that we have and face are a part of helping us to grow into something even more than what we thought we were or could be. They're about really helping us to move past our limiting thoughts and beliefs. They're about helping us to move into a place where we can express more of our unique divine nature. They're a way of helping us to really grow and not only make a difference in our own lives, but make a difference in the world. Rabindranath Tagore says, "I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy." I love that quote. It's just, I think, one of the most valuable things for us to recognize is that one of the things that helps us to get through our own challenges and difficulties is to do something for others. That's actually one of the tips, but that's not the first one I want to get to. First of all, one of the things that we need to say is that there are those who think that things are really very bad in the world right now. And there's 2 kinds of people in the world right now. Those who think there are 2 kinds of people in the world and those that don't. Right? But oftentimes we say there are two kinds of people in the world. There's optimists and pessimists. I'm not sure that that's totally accurate because there seems to be a spectrum. There are times that we're very optimistic and there are times that we're very pessimistic. But we will find that those who tend to be more optimistic about life will tend to be able to experience and move into and be participating in creating more of the blessings that life has available for us. We could think that things are getting very bad and that things are coming to an end, but Bill Harris says as things get worse, some will say that it's coming to an end, but when you start hearing that things are coming to an end, you can bet that that's a signal that things are about to get better. Such comments invariably come when things have gotten as bad as they're going to get. So without pain, how could we know joy? I came across this quote from a new movie that's out, a book that's out, and a new movie that's out. I haven't read the book, I haven't seen the movie, but I like the quote. It says, without pain, how could we know joy? This is an old argument in the field of thinking about suffering, and its stupidity and lack of sophistication could be plumbed for centuries, but suffice it to say that the existence of broccoli does not in any way affect the taste of chocolate. It's important to know these things. I like that. So those of you who are broccoli lovers, yeah, you like both. Okay, good. So one of the first tips that Bill Harris gives us is when you find yourself in troubling times, one of the first things he recommends that you do is stop blaming. Stop blaming. Because the moment that we begin to blame, we have automatically made ourselves a victim. Are you aware of that? The moment that you make someone else responsible for the situation and the circumstances in your life, you have automatically said to the universe, I have no power here. It's someone else. They did it. They're doing it, usually doing it to me. Any of this sound familiar? That's the chatter that it seems like it's just an automatic kind of thing sometimes, doesn't it? But one of the things he really encourages us to do is to let go of that knee-jerk reaction to make someone else responsible for your pain. Because the moment that you make someone else responsible for your pain, you have basically said, I have no way of moving out of this pain until they make some change. And so in order to be able to empower yourself, you have to be willing to stop empowering someone else. Because the reality is, the moment we blame someone else for the challenges, the difficulties, the circumstances of our life, we have said, I'm no longer a creative being, I am a victim, and someone else has to change in order for me to be happy. Someone else has to change in order for me to be well. Someone else has to change in order for me to be prosperous. Someone else has to change in order for me to be me. Can you see the fallacy of that way of thinking? Can you understand that that immediately is putting you in a place of not having power, of not being at the source of and tuned into the source of creation? You and I are created in the image and after the likeness of the divine. That makes us creative beings. And in the very act of blaming someone else, we are actually creating more opportunities for us to have those same kinds of experiences. You realize that? I'm sorry, has I stopped preaching and gone to meddling here?
I don't know, but I tuned out somewhere.
Oh, tuned out, okay, well, yeah, it's important for us to notice that also. So, the first tip for moving through troubled times is to accept that we are in the process always of creating our reality and our experiences. Notice I say our reality and our experiences. We're not necessarily creating the situation or circumstances, we're creating our reality and experience of the situation and circumstance. Does that make sense? So we are going to experience it as we choose and as we're choosing to see it. And so letting go of the need to blame is one of the ways that we move ourselves back into an awareness of our ability to be responsible, our ability to respond. And so a big part of moving out of the challenging times, the troubled times, is accepting responsibility for creating this experience. And if we can accept responsibility for creating the experience, we automatically empower ourselves to make a different choice, to change, to see it differently, to act differently, to think differently, to speak differently. But as long as someone else is responsible, we're still stuck in that place of not having the power to make a difference. Step one, stop blaming, even if it is their fault. In fact, I would say maybe especially if you think it's their fault, stop and catch yourself and ask yourself the question. This is a great question I love from Eric Butterworth. What's in this from me? What's in this from me? And if I can ask that question and listen, I will find that there's something in there that I have a way of seeing things, a choice that I've made, a decision I've made, a way I choose to look at things, or some little tape that I've got going in my head about poor me. Anybody know that one? If I keep playing that little tape, poor me, the universe says, oh, wow, that's here, have some more poor me. Doesn't it? We're always in the process of that creative process. And if we have those kind of habitual thinking patterns, it's important for us to pay attention and notice. Eckhart Tolle says, discontent, blaming, complaining, self-pity cannot serve us as a foundation for a good future, no matter how much effort that you make. So if we're still in that energy of discontent, blaming, complaining, self-pity, we are actually creating that same kind of future, aren't we? Bill says, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we're facing massive and fundamental changes in the way the world works in this society. And it's going to involve a period of challenging and tough times. So what can we do? Here's this Peanuts cartoon. Lucy goes up to Charlie Brown with a paper and pen, and he says, here, sign this. It absolves me of all blame. Then she goes to Schroeder with the same paper and says, here, sign this. It absolves me of all blame. And finally she comes to Linus and says, here, sign this. It absolves me of all blame. As she walks away, Linus goes, gee, that must be a nice document to have. We want ourselves to be absolved of all blame. And I think it's important for us to learn the distinction between blame and responsibility. Accepting responsibility is an empowering state of consciousness, isn't it? It says, I have the ability and the power to do something and to see something and make some difference. Blame, if we're blaming ourselves, we're basically saying, I don't have any power here. I have responsibility, and I'm wrong. That's the other piece of blame. Blame always has the wrong word in it, doesn't it? If we're blaming someone else, they're obviously wrong for doing whatever they've done. Right? That's the difference between responsibility and blame. If someone is responsible, that means, oh, you have the responsibility and you can make a difference. You can make a change. You can do something different here. But if I blame you, you've done something and you are wrong for doing it. Can you see the difference in that kind of awareness and kind of energy? And so if we can really shift that energy, we'll find that we're beginning to create from a different place. We're creating in a different way. So the second tip that Bill gives us, and I shared this some last week, when you find yourself going through difficult and challenging and troubled times, regardless of whether they're own personal troubled times or whether they're global troubled times, it's important to breathe into your heart. To breathe into your heart. Helen Keller said, "The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart." So one of the practices that I've come across comes from the HeartMath Institute, and many of you may be familiar with that. It's a very powerful work, and we're going to do some more work with that, but it's important for us to really begin to move into a place of breathing into the heart space. And it helps us to move back into that heart energy. We see the world more clearly through our hearts than we do through our eyes. You know that? We see the world more clearly through our hearts than we do with our thinking. And one of the ways that we work with that is to breathe into a 6 count, breathe into the heart, and find something to appreciate. Something or someone or something in the world, whether it be a painting or art or beauty or some quality that we can appreciate. Just practice that over and over again. And if you find yourself experiencing challenges or difficulties, if you will begin to make that shift, if you will take that time to breathe into that heart space and move back into the energy of appreciation, you will find that not only do you feel differently, but the situation will begin to look differently to you, and you'll begin to see and hear and get clearer guidance on how you can participate in a way that makes a difference in that circumstance or situation. Albert Einstein said the most beautiful things we can experience in this is the mysteries, is the mysterious. It's the source of all true art and science. And one of the things that helps us to move back into that awareness and that understanding is to remember our source. When you find yourselves going through challenging times, you can pretty much bet, and I think this is an insight that Eckhart Tolle really brings out very strongly. It means that we have identified with something other than our true nature. When we find ourselves personally going through troubling times, we have identified the self as being a thought that we have about ourselves, or we have identified ourselves as something that's going on out here in the world. We've identified our source as the government, our job, our spouse. I'm talking about source not only of funds, of income, or I'm talking about our source for love. We sometimes put our source out here in the world. We think that this other person is our source. In fact, the moment that we've blamed someone else, backing up a little bit, in a very real way, we have then also made that person a source. And we have forgotten where our real good comes from. And so the more we can re-identify ourselves and connect with our source, which is the spirit of the divine within our own hearts and minds, and recognize that those circumstances, the world out here really don't have the power to take away love from us. Don't have the power to take away abundance from us. They don't have the power to take away life and health from us. The power of those qualities and characteristics come from a single source, which is the presence of the divine in our own hearts and minds. Right? And so when we're in that place, reminding ourselves of our true source. It's not our spouse, it's not the government, it's not the job even for that matter, is it? Ultimately, it really is our own connection with the divine. And then Anais Nin says, love never dies a natural death. It dies because we don't know how to replenish its source. It dies of blindness and errors and betrayals. It dies of illness and wounds. It dies of weariness, of withering, and of tarnishings. And it's because we have disconnected from the source of love. It's like cutting down a tree. I mean, if you cut down a tree, it's no longer connected to its roots. It's not going to be fed anymore, right? And then A third tip that he gives us. A third tip that Bill Harris gives us for traveling through troubled times. Let go of attachments. Let go of attachments. You know, be like the vacuum cleaner salesman. the enlightened vacuum cleaner salesman. I gave up all his attachments, right? Let go of attachments to things. Let go of attachments to just let go of attachments to how you think the world is supposed to be. That's one of our biggest addictions, I think, is that we seem to be very addicted to having the world be the way we think it's supposed to be. It's true, isn't it? Yeah. So if we can let go of that addiction and recognize that there are ways that the world can be that are so much greater than our own even imagination can really, than we can even know. But we won't experience that if we find ourselves in the energy of resistance. Attachment, one of the things I talk about in terms of attachment's an interesting thing. We get attached to things because we have a desire for something. It's okay to have a desire for the world to be a particular way, right? I think that's really important. It's important because we are creative beings and we want to direct that creative power. We want to be able to direct that creative power in a way that is focused in allowing the creative power that comes through us to move in a way that is uplifting, that is enhancing, that's fulfilling, that feels good, that we prefer in life. But the difference between having a desire, and the word desire comes from the word de and sire, which means of the source, and having an attachment is actually a fear of not having that which we desire. Let me say that again, because this is an important and valuable distinction. When we are attached to something, we hold on to it really tight because we're afraid of not having it. Or even if we don't seem to have it, we're struggling really hard to try and get it, which is another way of it being attached. We're struggling really hard to try and get something that we think that we have to have in order to be happy, fulfilled. And it's a fear of not having that. The interesting dynamic in terms of the law of attraction is this. You know that old saying, that which I fear has come upon me? And so if we have this desire, and then we also have a fear of not having the desire, we're creating this kind of push me, pull me experience. We're finding ourselves getting stuck a lot of times in the creative process, and we are creating this stuck place of desiring something, and at the same time, the fear of not having it is pushing it away. That makes sense? Well, it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense, right? It actually is kind of crazy if you think about it, but that's what we do. Am I right? And so one of the things for us to really begin to recognize is when we're caught in this loop or this trap of being attached, if we can move into a place of having a clear desire and then trusting and being assured that this or something even better is already coming to us. It's already available. It already exists. It already exists in the spiritual realm. We wouldn't desire it if it didn't already exist. We wouldn't even have the desire if it didn't already exist for us in some way. And so part of our waking up is to recognize that the process really is letting go of what's getting in the way of it being in our awareness and in our energy and in our consciousness. And so the attachment itself, letting go of the attachment actually allows us to experience that which already is. Does that make sense? Good awarenesses. All right. And then one other tip that he gives us, if we're finding ourselves experiencing troubling times, is to trust the process. Trust the process. Who knows? Perhaps losing or a loss at the doorway to some is the doorway to some amazing endeavor, adventure, or experience that we're not aware of yet. Arthur C. Clarke once said, every revolutionary idea evokes 3 stages of reaction. 1, it's completely impossible. 2, it's possible, but it's not worth doing. And 3, I said it was a good idea all along. Does that sound familiar? We have a tendency to do that ourselves, don't we? And so when we find ourselves in the middle of a challenging or difficult situation or circumstance, I think it's valuable to recognize eventually we may be saying, I thought that was a pretty good idea after all, you know? We may find ourselves that there's something more happening than our limited awareness. And if we're willing to be open to that possibility, what you'll find is not only will your awareness begin to shift, but you'll begin to experience what that good is more quickly. I'll tell you a short story here. When I was, I've told this story before, but just a great example of this experience for myself. When I was getting ready to go into ministerial school, I had one of my desires was to go into the ministerial training and not have any debts to pay, not have any monthly payments and that sort of thing. I wanted to be able to just not have to focus on and be concerned about all that. And so I remember I was driving to work one day, getting ready for making that transition to go up into Unity Village and the training. And as I was driving to work, I stopped by the insurance office. I think my insurance was due that day. I went in and made my insurance payment on my car. And so I left there, and immediately I left there. I was driving to work, and I stopped at a stoplight, and the lady behind me didn't, and ran into the back of my little Subaru Brat. And my little Subaru Brat, I loved my little Subaru Brat, and she crunched up the back end of my little Subaru Brat, and I got out of my Subaru, and I went around and looked, and on the back of my bumper, I'd just recently gotten a bumper sticker from Unity in Little Rock, as a matter of fact, and it said, "I can't wait to see the good that's going to come out of this." I can't wait. And I'm going, okay, I can't wait to see the good that's going to come out of this. And so I really kind of shifted in that moment, like, oh, okay, this is what is, and I can't wait to see the good that's going to come out of this. And you know, one of the things that happened was that the lady says, you know, I don't want to necessarily go through my insurance. I know it'll raise my insurance rates. Just get an estimate, and I'll write a check to you. And she wrote me a check, and it was just enough to pay off all the debts that I had. And instead of getting my vehicle fixed, I decided to pay off my debts, and I went up to Unity Village with this little Subaru Brat with the tail end crunched in, and I drove it around for several years. But you know, the neat thing is on the way up there, I drove up there and I stopped at a little truck stop, and they had these interesting bumper stickers, and they had one that was a big Band-Aid about this big that said, "Ouch." And I stuck that on the back of my Subaru Brat. And for about 2 years, I drove that thing around that way. And then when I left ministerial school, I actually sold it to a friend of mine. And he drove it around for about 5 more years with the ouch. So that little Subaru Brat actually became well known around the Lee Summit area. So anyway, you know, the thing is, if we find ourselves going through a challenging time, if we will take an understanding and awareness that even what seems to be challenging for us right now can turn into something even better. And if we're open to that possibility and willing to shift our thinking about it, we will find that we're able to see that much more quickly and much more easily. That's why Paul, I believe, always said, always and in everything, give thanks. Always and in everything, give thanks. If we can do that and we can make that shift, we will find that things begin to change for us fairly quickly. In St. John 12:24, it says, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." It bears much fruit. So even though it may seem like things are dark for us, we don't know the possibilities and the good that can come out of this. This is one of the things that we talk about in terms of transitions. Emily Cady talks about the idea of chemicalization. Chemicalization is the reaction akin to mixing two incompatible chemicals together. They fizz and sputter and churn and seethe, and occasionally they even explode. So in a sense, one who is experiencing chemicalization is experiencing withdrawal symptoms. he or she is really breaking an addiction. In this case, it's breaking an addiction to an old way of thinking. But the effects can be similar to breaking an addiction to a drug. If you ever have tried to stop smoking or drinking or using any other addictive substance, you have a sense of how changing thinking can affect your life. This is from Richard and Mary Alice Jaffola on The Quest. So in a very real sense, one of the things that we're talking about here is shifting from seeing the problem from a place of challenge, difficulty, woe is me kind of thinking, to looking at it as a possibility for something greater, some greater good to come into your life. So that's your homework for this week and probably the rest of this life. So I encourage you to take some time this week to think about these tips. Let me just kind of briefly go over the ones. First of all, stop blaming. Remember your source. Let go of attachments. Trust the process. And give thanks. We're going to talk more about this as we go through the next couple of weeks. All right, let's move into our meditation time. And as you breathe in, count to a count of 6. Breathing into the heart space. And as you breathe out, count to a count of 6. And just do that for a moment. And as you breathe in, notice and think of something that you feel appreciation for. Perhaps it's a person. Perhaps it's not just a person, but a quality that person has, you've seen in that person. Think about what that quality is and let your heart be filled with a feeling of appreciation for that quality. And notice and see if you don't also have that quality within yourself, or the desire to experience more of that quality. And appreciate just the desire for that quality. If you find yourself blaming or judging someone in your life, is there someone that you have made and empowered with the ability to make the difference for you? And if so, I encourage you just to release that and bless them and acknowledge that they are not your source. The situation is not your source. The circumstance is not your source. That you have one source, the Spirit of the divine within you. And you have the power to choose. You have the power to accept and receive the good from that source. If you find yourself holding on to something or someone or some circumstance being the way you think it should be, take a moment now to be willing to simply focus in on the desire behind that. Notice the desire, accept the desire, and accept that it already exists for you in some way. Let go of the fear of not having it. And feel the experience of having this or something even better. Let your heart be filled with a sense of gratitude, knowing that the something even better is already available, is already there for you. Let your heart be filled with a sense of gratitude, knowing that you are in the presence of love, of abundance, of peace, of power, of joy. Fill your heart with the gratitude of this. Take a nice deep breath now. Let your awareness come back into this room, this time and place. Take another nice deep breath. And take one more nice deep breath and gently open your eyes and give thanks. And so it is.